Machiavelli's most dangerous observation about women. In 1513, a man called Niccolò Machiavelli, who had lost everything, his career, his reputation, his freedom, sat in a farmhouse outside Florence and wrote the most dangerous sentence about women ever committed to paper. Not dangerous because it was cruel, not dangerous because it was wrong. Dangerous because every man who has ever loved someone, trusted someone, built something with someone, and then watched it dissolve without understanding why, will read that sentence and feel it land somewhere so precise it almost hurts to breathe. The Catholic Church banned what he wrote. Political leaders called him a devil. His name became the word we use for manipulation itself. And none of that happened because Machiavelli was lying. It happened because he was describing something that was already happening in your relationships, in your home, in the quiet negotiations that occur between every man and every woman before either of them says a word. What he documented was not a theory, it was a pattern, the same pattern that has governed the rise and fall of every powerful man in recorded history, including the ones who swore they were immune to it. And once you understand what he actually saw, not the political version, not the academic version, but the raw, unfiltered observation he buried inside the chapters scholars skip, you will not be able to look at the people closest to you the same way again. Not because they are evil, but because you will finally understand the game that was always being played and why you were never given the rules. Machiavelli was not a misogynist. That is the first illusion that needs to die before any of this makes sense. He was a diagnostician. The way a surgeon is not cruel for cutting, he is precise. Machiavelli was not condemning women when he wrote about them. He was documenting a force. A force he had watched, across 30 years of diplomatic service, destroy men who were stronger, smarter, and more prepared than most people reading about them today. He had watched it happen to princes. He had watched it happen to popes. And sitting in that farmhouse, stripped of everything, he had enough silence around him to finally admit he had watched it happen to himself. He wrote in The Prince, "It is better to be impetuous than cautious, for fortune is a woman, and if you wish to keep her under it, is necessary to beat and maul her." Every modern reader stops at the violence of that sentence and never gets to the philosophy inside it. Fortune, for Machiavelli, was not luck in the way we use the word today. Fortune was the irrational, emotional, cyclical force beneath all human events, the tide that no amount of preparation fully controls, the current that runs under every plan and every alliance and every promise. He called it feminine, not out of contempt, but out of recognition. Because what he had observed, in court after court, city after city, negotiation after negotiation, was that the emotional current in any room where power lived did not flow through the man with the title. It flowed through whoever controlled the temperature of that room, and that control, more often than not, did not announce itself. It arrived softly. It arrived warmly. It arrived in a way that made you grateful for its presence before you had any reason to examine its terms. This is where most men's education ends. They are taught to fear the enemy in front of them. The one who carries a weapon, makes demands, declares intentions. They are never taught to examine the force that arrives as comfort, because comfort does not feel like a threat. It feels like relief. And Machiavelli's most dangerous observation was precisely this, that the most effective form of power in human history has never been the kind that conquers. It has been the kind that invites. The kind that makes you lower your defenses, not through force, but through warmth. The kind that does not need to take anything because it has taught you to give everything voluntarily. Think about the men Machiavelli studied. Caesar, who was warned repeatedly, who was not a naive man, who had navigated the most treacherous political landscape in the ancient world, undone, not on the battlefield, but in the private geometries of trust and intimacy that surrounded him. Samson, whose strength was legendary, whose enemies could not break him from the outside, destroyed by the patient, repeated softness of someone who had learned exactly where to press. Solomon, the wisest man in the ancient world by his own tradition's account, who wrote entire books about discernment and still watched his kingdom fracture because of what happened in his private life. Machiavelli had read all of them, and what he saw was not a coincidence. It was a pattern so consistent across cultures and centuries that he could only conclude it was structural. It was not a flaw in these men. It was a feature of the force they had encountered. He wrote, "Men in general judge more by their eyes than by their hands, because seeing is given to everyone, touching to few." What he was describing is the architecture of seduction, not only sexual seduction, but the broader seduction of narrative, of warmth, of the version of yourself that someone else seems to believe in. When someone shows you a version of yourself that you want to be true, a version that is capable and admired and understood, you will do extraordinary things to stay inside that reflection. You will compromise positions you swore were fixed. You will rationalize distances you swore you would never cross. You will work harder, give more, tolerate what you never tolerated before, not because you have been forced to, but because the image in that mirror feels so close to the man you always wanted to be that losing access to it feels like losing yourself. This is not weakness. Machiavelli was clear about that. He never called the men who fell to this force stupid or small. He called them human. And then he said something that no philosopher before him had the precision or the courage to say plainly, that being human in this specific way, in this specific vulnerability, is the single greatest political liability any man can carry. Because the people who understand how that vulnerability works and who are willing to use it without the restraint that conscience provides, will always have access to a lever inside you that no armor can protect. And here is where it gets uncomfortably specific, because Machiavelli did not just identify the force, he mapped it. He documented the stages through which it operates, the sequence it follows so consistently across so many different men and so many different contexts, that reading it feels less like history and more like someone describing your last 3 years back to you in a language you did not know existed until this moment. The first stage, he observed, was what he called the opening of the gate. Every fortress, he wrote, has walls. Every man, regardless of how self-possessed he appears, regardless of how disciplined his exterior, carries an interior life that is hungry. Hungry for understanding, for warmth, for the specific relief of being seen by someone who does not require you to perform. And the force he was documenting does not attack that hunger, it feeds it. In the beginning, it feeds it generously, almost overwhelmingly, with a quality of attention that feels so rare, so precisely calibrated to what you have always needed, that your entire nervous system interprets it as safety, as arrival. As the end of a search you had been conducting so long, you had stopped admitting you were still looking. Machiavelli wrote, "The promise given was a necessity of the past. The word broken is a necessity of the present." He was not celebrating that reality. He was warning that the promise, the warmth, the attention of the opening is not necessarily a lie in the moment it is given. It is a tool whose utility changes as the situation changes. And a man who does not understand that will spend years trying to return to a version of a relationship that served its purpose the moment he opened the gate. The second stage is what Carl Jung, 4 centuries after Machiavelli, would call the anima projection. Jung observed that every man carries inside him an internalized image of the feminine, built from his earliest experiences of warmth and withdrawal, of being held and being released, of the first face that taught him what love felt like, and the first moment that face looked away. He called this image the anima, and he said it is the most powerful psychological force in a man's inner life, not because it is always active, but because when something in the external world matches it closely enough, the man does not see the person in front of him anymore. He sees the image. He falls in love not with a woman, but with his own deepest longing, wearing a woman's face. And once that projection is in place, he will defend it with a ferocity that has nothing to do with the actual person and everything to do with what that person has come to represent inside him. He will fight for the image. He will sacrifice for the image. He will destroy other parts of his life to protect the image. And the person wearing that projection, whether they understand what is happening or not, whether they are operating consciously or from pure instinct, now holds a lever that reaches all the way down to the foundation of who he is. Machiavelli saw this same phenomenon playing out politically, and he named it with his characteristic precision. He wrote, "The lion cannot protect himself from traps, and the fox cannot defend himself from wolves. One must therefore be a fox to recognize traps, and a lion to frighten wolves." What he was saying is that strength alone, raw masculine force, courage, aggression, dominance, is completely useless against a certain category of threat. Because that category of threat does not come as a wolf. It comes as something that makes the lion want to lie down. And a man who has only ever learned to fight has no framework for understanding why he is losing ground to something that has never once raised its voice at him. The third stage is the most painful to describe because it is the one most men are currently living inside without knowing it. Machiavelli called it the slow renegotiation. It does not happen in a single conversation or a single event. It happens across hundreds of small moments, each one individually so minor that to object to any single one of them would seem unreasonable, even paranoid, a standard that shifts slightly, a boundary that moves an inch, a dynamic that recalibrates so gradually that by the time you notice the distance between where you started and where you are now, you cannot identify the moment it changed because there was no moment. There were only increments, and each increment came wrapped in something that felt like intimacy, like progress, like the natural deepening of a connection that you had already invested too much of yourself in to examine objectively. This is what Machiavelli meant when he wrote, "Never attempt to win by force what can be won by deception." He was not writing a manual for cruelty. He was writing an autopsy of every court he had ever served in. He was documenting the method that works so consistently across so many different kinds of relationships, precisely because it never triggers the defenses that force would trigger. Force makes a man stand up. Force makes a man fight. But a slow renegotiation conducted through warmth and intimacy and the constant implication that your discomfort with the process is actually evidence of your own inadequacy that does not make a man stand up. It makes him apologize. It makes him work harder. It makes him internalize the frame that has been built around him until he is maintaining his own cage from the inside and calling it love. Jung wrote about this in his exploration of the shadow, that dimension of the psyche where everything we refuse to see about ourselves and about the dynamics we inhabit gets stored. He said the shadow does not disappear when you ignore it. It grows. It begins to operate autonomously, pulling you toward patterns you would consciously reject if you could see them clearly. But you cannot see them clearly because seeing them would require confronting not just what is being done, but what you have been willing to accept. And that confrontation carries a cost that most men spend their entire lives finding sophisticated ways to avoid. Machiavelli and Jung were describing the same territory from opposite ends of the same century-spanning corridor. One was mapping the external political expression of a force. The other was mapping its internal psychological architecture. And when you lay those two maps on top of each other, what you get is something so complete, so precise, so ruthlessly accurate about the specific way power moves through intimate relationships, that it stops feeling like philosophy and starts feeling like a mirror held up to the part of your life you have been most carefully not looking at. Now, here is the part that changes everything, because everything up to this point could be heard as an indictment, as a reason for suspicion, for withdrawal, for the kind of cold and armored way of moving through the world that protects you from being hurt, but also guarantees you will never build anything real. And Machiavelli, for all his precision, for all his willingness to document what others refuse to see, was not advocating for that. He was not telling men to become foxes who trust no one and feel nothing. He was telling them something far more demanding than that. He was telling them to see clearly and then choose consciously, because the man who sees the game and refuses to play it out of fear is not free. He is just afraid in a different direction. The man Machiavelli was trying to build, through all of his writing, through all of his unflinching documentation of how power actually works, rather than how we wish it worked, was a man who could hold two things simultaneously: the full weight of what is true, and the full capacity for genuine engagement with life, despite that truth. Not innocence, which is just ignorance with better lighting, but something harder and rarer, the kind of clarity that does not require you to close your heart to function, because it is not the heart that was ever the problem, it was the blindness. He wrote, "The first method for estimating the intelligence of a ruler is to look at the men he has around him. Extend that beyond politics. Look at what you have allowed into your intimate life. Look at the dynamics you have normalized. Look at the version of yourself that exists inside your closest relationships, and ask, with the precision Machiavelli demanded of every prince he ever counseled, whether that version of you is expanding or contracting. Whether the people closest to you are drawing out the most sovereign, most grounded, most genuinely alive version of who you are, or whether they have, through the slow renegotiation, through the warmth that arrived as a gate opener and stayed as a lever, taught you to make yourself smaller in ways you have dressed up as maturity, as compromise, as love. Because here is what Machiavelli understood about love that almost no one in his century was willing to write down. Love is not the absence of power. Every relationship that has ever existed between two human beings has a power structure inside it. The question is never whether that structure exists. The question is whether it is visible. The question is whether both people inside it are conscious of it and have chosen it freely, or whether one person is conscious of it and the other has been carefully kept from examining it too closely. And the observation he made, the one that got his books banned and his name blackened and his legacy twisted into a synonym for evil for 500 years, was simply this: that the most sophisticated wielders of relational power he had ever encountered were not the men with armies. They were not the men with money. They were the people who had learned, through instinct or through intention, to make their power invisible by making you feel that everything you were doing, everything you were giving, everything you were becoming inside the relationship was entirely your own free choice. That is the observation. That is the thing he wrote in exile, in poverty, in the silence that follows total loss, that threatened every comfortable story. Every powerful institution needed its people to keep believing. Not that women are dangerous, not that intimacy is a trap, but that power, without visibility, is the most complete form of power that exists, and that the people most likely to wield it without accountability are the ones you have already decided to trust completely, because you made that decision before you understood what you were deciding. And now that you understand what Machiavelli actually saw, the question that remains, the one he spent the rest of his life circling without ever fully answering, is not how to protect yourself from this force. It is something older and more difficult than that. It is whether a man who sees all of this clearly, who understands the architecture of the game and the history of everyone who has ever lost it, can still choose to love, not from blindness, not from need, but from the rarest place in the human character, the place Machiavelli himself could only gesture toward from his farmhouse in the dark, the place where full knowledge of how the world works meets the deliberate, conscious, sovereign decision to remain open to it anyway, because that, and only that, is what separates the man who was broken by what Machiavelli wrote from the man who was built by it. If this opened something in you that you are not finished thinking about, stay with it the next time we go deeper.